Good morning, Revolution, everybody, and welcome to our stream. And hello, Pooja. Hello, Bobby. Hello, Joe. Welcome. Great to see all of you this fine March Friday morning. Our subject this morning is: do boycotts work? Do they work? There was a big boycott last Friday, February 28th, against a lot of the corporations who were uh, pushing back against diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there was a spontaneous call for a boycott. And so we're going to be debating its efficacy. I want to remind everybody that you can tune in and watch us on YouTube, on Twitter or X. I prefer calling it Twitter because Musk called it X, and I don't want to have anything to do with that joker. Facebook and Twitch, you can find us on Twitch. So let me expand a little bit on the topic this morning. We're talking tactics, right? How do we use all of the tools in the toolbox to advance working class interests? And by tools, we mean strikes, we mean boycotts, we mean occupation, sit-ins, petitions, voting, you name it. And in particular this morning, as I said, we're talking boycotts because of what happened last Friday. And we're talking about it because in some quarters, there was a lot of criticism of the tactic. Oh, it's not effective. Oh, it's misguided. Oh, it's focusing on consumers and not workers. Um, and in fact, some, and I'll come back to it a little bit later, counterposed the issue of boycotts to real working class struggle like strikes, which I found kind of curious. But we'll come back to that in just a few moments. First, let's talk about how we got into this situation. Bobby, let's start with you. You know, after the election, and in particular after the inauguration, there was a certain, I don't know what you want to call it, lull. Um, uh, you might say uh, paralysis, maybe that's too strong, in the response to Trump's election. It certainly wasn't like what happened in 2017, even though groups were organizing online in a big way, like that huge meeting that the Working Families Party organized of 120,000 people. But there wasn't like demonstrative action in the streets. Let's say that it's true. Um, why was that? And do you think the situation has changed since then? What's your opinion? Can't hear you.
That's unusual. I think that's a tough one because people probably were taken aback by the Trump victory, and honestly, kind of a sense of mourning or disappointment that so many of the American people either didn't vote or voted for Trump. And so there was a time of gathering of, uh, thinking about it. But I think that time is over, and the amount of spontaneous actions and creative responses has really been amazing up to now. So I think that this boycott uh, call responded to people's desire to do something, and not to do something alone, but to do something as part of a group.
Okay. Pooja, what was the situation in Colorado? You've been out there for a while now. How are folks responding to Trump's election? Rank and file, and what about the main organizations and movements? I heard that in the Colorado trade union movement and in the legislature there was this effort to de-Trumpify the state to protect it against Trump's possible incursion, particularly on immigrant rights.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot of on the ground organizing happening here. There's a lot of immigrant, particularly focused work happening, a lot of know your rights training. There is also a concentrated effort currently in the legislature to try to codify, we obviously codified abortion in the election. Now we're really working on trying to have better union rights. A lot of folks don't know that Colorado has a two-tier election system for the NLRB and private sector elections. So trying to get rid of the two election system is a big thought out here. Um, it's interesting because I think I said this the last time I was on here, but Colorado was one of the only states that actually ended up going left in terms of the electorate and in terms of the things that we were voting for. And now we're seeing a pretty heavy pushback, obviously, from the administration and from the right wing to try to manage and mitigate what's been happening out here, which is really a lot of people rising up and saying, we like what's happening here. We like our politics here. We want them to be even more working class focused. How can we make that happen? And my baby also has opinions on this, so you might hear her in the background every once in a while. So, um, but yeah, so it's really we're seeing a lot of pushback from the working class electorate, and we're seeing a lot of pushback from the Nazis in charge as well. So as you might
Good,
imagine,
good, good.
yeah.
Progressive Revolutionary Colorado showing us how it's done. What about Iowa, Joe? How did folks respond? And I know that you are involved in a lot of Latino struggles, trade union struggles, immigrant rights struggles. Um, what's taking place there? Was there this lull, or did Iowa follow Colorado's example?
Well, I think people were getting prepared. They were waiting for a call to action. People were just being notified. Activists, people concerned about the Trump administration. They wanted to hear more on direction, and that didn't quite happen. There was not picketing at Walmart and so forth here in Des Moines. There should have been, but there wasn't really a coordinated action. And I can talk more about kind of historically how we've done things in the past when it comes to boycotts, because boycotts take a lot of work. They need to have media components, people on the ground. There needs to be kind of a historical perspective to them. This one was, unfortunately, it was too much of a shake and bake type of action without enough preparation. And really, there needed to be more of a solid platform to really get it off the ground. But I am hopeful that that it can be done in an effective way. We have May coming up. May is a good time to launch boycotts. And historically, when we've looked at boycotts, they have been planned well in advance, and they've had several different types of components to really get them off the ground. The Great Boycott, when we look at the Latino community, and then in 2020, when we were fighting for meatpacking workers during COVID, we had a meatless May that got a lot of national attention, really did kind of impact a lot of the meat processing companies across the country. So,
I,
that's it. More needs to be discussed on that.
we'll be coming back to that in just a moment. Yeah, there's a long history of boycotts. I mean, when I was a child, I didn't eat grapes and lettuce for about 10 years. I was so mad at my mother. I didn't know what to do. Bobby, look, I was dismayed uh, by the response of congressional Democrats after the election, up through recently. Not all of them, not all of them. The squad was on the front line. Bernie was on the front line. Others, few others. But I was dismayed by they're voting for the Lakin Riley bill, which demands, and this is really important, that bill requires the indefinite detention of any immigrant accused of theft without trial. and bunch of Democrats voted for it. And then there was that teaching communism bill passed with Democratic support. And then there was the bill on the nonprofits, saying that they're supporting terrorism, so on. And so forth. But after a big campaign by Move On, Indivisible, some labor groups, rank and file folks targeting the Democratic members of Congress, they started to find their voice, you know, and they started to get some spine. And last week, every last Democrat in the House of Representatives voted against the GOP budget, part of which is calling for taking hundreds of billions of dollars out of Medicaid in order to give tax breaks to the super rich. But, and this is an important but, yesterday, 10 Democrats voted to censure Representative Green. What do you think about that? You know, there is still, as we say back in Youngstown, a long road to hoe when it comes to putting enough pressure on these representatives to do the right thing, isn't it? What's your opinion?
Well, that was a disgrace for those Democrats to vote against that very courageous action of Representative Green. But I think the bigger answer here is everything you just laid out proves the need for the working class to be the lead in our movement, because that is what is really going to represent the real interest of the people, and not be so cowed and intimidated by whoever the current leadership is. And I'm kind of proud right now, really, of our labor movement, that it has not waffled. They're not backing down. All over, I know in Chicago, where I live, organizing Know Your Rights activities for both union and non-union workers, calling for May Day demonstrations, hearings for the rights of federal workers and postal workers, a real fight back approach, not backing down. And I think that just more than anything demonstrates the need for that kind of leadership. I also want to, maybe I have a little different angle than Joe Henry about boycotts, which it's great to plan them. But I think that this call by Reverend Jamal Bryant, I believe from Georgia, from a mega congregation, to boycott Target, took off. It was a wonderful initiative. I read some statistics that 16% of the American people said they were going to participate in that boycott, and the figures show that it was actually very effective. Is this the time to talk about the role of boycotts, or you want me to hold off on that?
Hold off for just a second. We're going to come to that in just a second. But there are planned, and then there are spontaneous things that happen, and it kind of depends on the level of the movement at any given moment in time. But since you referred to Joe, let me ask you, just going back to the question that I posed to Bobby. We don't want to write folks off. We don't want to write Democrats off in general with a blanket. You're all blanked up. I get that. I do. Some of these people who voted, those 10, some of those who voted for the bill on nonprofits, are in swing districts, right? They're in swing districts, and they feel like they got to make some concessions on this or that, uh, so that they don't get targeted as heavily in the primary or in the general election. Um, they're in vulnerable seats, You think that's justifiable? Is that a
Well, no,
justifiable position?
no, it's not justifiable. But I think the thing that is missing, though, is in those swing districts is that those elected officials may be focused on the so-called regular voters. Those
Mm.
are predominantly white voters, and they are not focused on all voters, which brown and black voters, non-regular voters. And there hasn't been, in my opinion, mobilization of all working people, all possible voters who would listen to taking more of a progressive move on that. So mobilization of all working people is very important and something that the Democrats have been unwilling to do for the last couple of decades, which has really caused a backslide. But that could also be a bigger discussion that we could have on how that's done. But as long as Democrats elected officials in areas like in swing states focus on just a certain core of voters who they've been able to rely on, then the attention will not be on what all working people are concerned about. So that is a big issue.
Pooja, what do you think? Is I mean, they're in swing districts and they're counting on that independent vote. Is that strategy correct, or is there a need for a new politics? Like I was really impressed by the campaign of Dan Osborne in Nebraska, who ran as an independent and almost won that Senate seat. What do you think?
I think the electorate is dying for politics that matter. I think you're seeing it all throughout the country. I think you're seeing it. I mean, even in the Democratic official response to Trump's State of the Union speech with Alyssa Slotkin, she compared growing up under Reagan to what some of the biggest beautiful parts of being an American, right? It is high time that we uh, as I say we because there's no other option for many of us other than to align with the Democratic Party because of the way that the two-party system is set up in this country. Which, if folks don't know, I think it's helpful to mention that there's been a concentrated effort to make it more difficult for third-party candidates to run, right? Whether that's collecting more signatures than any other party in certain states or having to run in every single gubernatorial election in some states to ensure party access. There's a lot of restrictions placed on other parties to try and stop the rise of any other candidate, which is why, to your point, Dan Osborne is interesting because he ran as an independent and outside of the two-party structure and almost won, right? So it shows the hunger even in these parts of the country where I think typical Democratic politics have sort of written off as being too rural, too red, unwinnable. Even now you're seeing a response to the AOCs, the Bernies, by saying, and from the Democratic consultant class, basically saying we need to stay far away from the radical left messaging because it's so unpopular. It's just untrue, right? The Democrats have no plan, and they have no desire to really stand out into the working class because they know the working class politics are popular, right? Um, I thought an interesting turn, obviously, from labor champion Sherrod Brown out in Ohio, who ended up losing his seat. But a really interesting turn that's coming from him right now is this messaging about how Democrats have to return and become the party of the working class in order to become a viable party. And I think that's true. And I think it's very difficult for the donor class to imagine giving up their positions of power and their like connections and their brunches and their little like drinking parties that they like to do with everybody, which if you've ever spent any time in Democratic politics, it's a lot about the schmooze and it's a lot about the hanging out and who you know instead of actually trying to organize the unorganized, um, instead of trying to get working class issues out into the foray of the regular voter. I think our issues are people's issues, right? So they're popular, and the more and faster we return to trying to organize around those things and getting people out to vote for those things, the more we're going to see success. And honestly, I don't know, like as a whole, Democrats don't really know how to handle success. So I think it's incumbent on the left to teach them, because we have success, right? We know how to win through union victories. We know how to win through populism of the left. And I think it's time for us to really start thinking about how we can, run our own candidates, how we can really start to infiltrate through the labor movement, which is happening. I think, to Bobby's point, the most organized response you're seeing to, for example, what's happening to the mass exodus of, or the mass firing of federal workers, is what's happening through AFG, their union, right? Through the SEIU lawsuit, through all of these lawsuits coming from the labor movement, which, it stands to see how what we do with the court system, but the most organized response is coming from the working class, frankly, and it's only going to keep happening. So I think we really need to figure out how we can get ourselves into positions of power.
Bobby, Pooja's last point is very powerful because it was in this very complicated situation of an extreme fascist danger. And I know people thought, "Oh, you're exaggerating." You don't think that anymore, do you? You know, after Trump and Musk and Vance and going over to Europe and endorsing Nazis and calling on South African, white Afrikaners to come to the United States because they are allegedly discriminated against, and calling black and brown people low IQ, and on and on and on and on. So it was in this situation of a very complicated, extreme fascist danger and a certain lull in the movement, um, that combined with a outrage on the part of big sections of the broad working class public, that we saw as spontaneous calls for uh, three hugely important protests. First, on January the 18th, that was initiated by the Women's March on DC. Tens of thousands of people came out and protested pretty much spontaneously. Then on President's Day in 50 states, protests all over the country. And then last Friday, as you spoke about, this call for the boycott of Target and other corporations that were retreating on DEI. So, in your opinion, was and by the way, tactics have to be, attuned to the concrete circumstances that exist at any given moment. Sometimes they're planned and organized, sometimes they're spontaneous. So, in this particular situation, was the boycott idea an appropriate tactic? And I think you indicated that there's some evidence that it was successful.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, it was reported that not reported widely, and I think we have to think about why this whole boycott thing didn't make the big news. 16% of the American people said they were participating. The drop of traffic for Target was way down. And at the same time, Costco, which had been considered a progressive force on DEI, went way up. I read that African American people spend $12 million a day normally at Target. So that was a great opportunity to flex that muscle. The way that the boycott spread is really interesting because it wasn't covered at all by the corporate press. People spread it through their social media. And I heard lots of reports of friends telling friends or emailing or however they, different apps, and recruiting each other to participate in that. So I think that we should also notice that this is continuing, and it's continuing through the season of Lent, which is very attuned to people's cultural practices. give up purchasing at Target during Lent. I think we're gonna we need to publicize to people how much that this had an impact on Target itself and how much their sales were affected. I think that people then can feel good about having participated in something. And part of tactics isn't only how much you impinge on the corporate target. It's also the effect that it has on the people participating. And I think that this tactic of having a consumer boycott was a way to mobilize collectively the outrage that people have, not just against Target and not just about DEI, but against the abuses of corporate America that are kind of personified by Trump and Elon Musk. And in that sense, it's only the beginning of, I would guess, future actions.
Joe, you as a trade unionist and community activist, you've had experience with boycotts. You want to talk about that a little bit, and when was it appropriate? How did it work? How did you
Mhm.
measure the impact
Yeah.
of the boycott tactic?
Well, in the 1990s, when I was working in the Ron Kerry administration for the Teamsters in DC, what we did is, first of all, when Ron Kerry took office, we realized that we had forever strikes, that we weren't succeeding in negotiating contracts. The strikes were not working. We had a lot of freight drivers out there for over a year on strike. And a new way had to be developed, and that was the boycotts. And we did learn a lesson, because many of our progressives, fellow socialists, communists who were working in that administration look back at the boycott that had happened in the fight to end apartheid in South Africa back in the 80s. There was a boycott back then, a long one, with also divestment of Krugerrand, stuff like that. So those type of things were used in the 90s during within the Teamster administration to win good contracts. So we used the boycott to win contracts within freight, within warehouse, and it was very effective. There were a number of contract campaigns that I was on. Pony Express was one of them, where we used the boycott to boycott corporations that were funding Pony Express to be able to negotiate those contracts. And that was very effective. We also were preparing to do that with the UPS negotiations in 1997. But clearly, what it did require, it required us to plan things out well in advance, to work on what was the narrative in how that boycott, what did that mean for working people when we went out on strike? And I mean, when we did the boycott. And clearly now with this 2.0 of the Trump administration, how does the boycott really help us to really change things and to help the working class? So, working on the media component, the narrative, the maybe roving boycotts, and also into the boardrooms of those corporations who support Trump would be very important, and then of course Tesla with Elon Musk and the things that he has impacted. But those are working on specific narratives on a communication plan that has also to working in coalition with organizations that really have a face out there that the media can communicate with. Because in the Teamsters, we had another real positive things going for us. The media knew who the Teamsters were. We had a long history of fighting for good contracts. They knew that they could reach out to us when we did these boycotts. And we had media people in place who were reaching out to the legacy media, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco, Los Angeles, so forth and so on. So we were pushing a specific narrative out there of what the boycott meant, how it impacted working people, the fight for the working class. And we also had hundreds of Teamster locals out there with members promoting the message, doing things on the ground, doing things with informational pickets in front of specific corporations that we wanted to target, that the media could also interview those workers who were doing the boycott on the ground. That type of sophistication can be done in the present period when we do these boycotts, but there has to be a specific narrative, a specific corporation that is focused upon. At any point we can do, roving boycotts, different corporations, but the narrative must be refined. There must be coalitions made up of well-known organizations that the media can reach out to do those interviews, and we must have, the type of communication with the media, to make it clear to them where we are doing the boycotts and how we have a visible face that they can interview. If we just do it on social media, it's very hard to interview anybody by the media, by reporters, if nobody is out there in front of a Walmart, in front of a Target, with posters to be able to communicate and provide the message of the working class. So those things are very important. That's things that we learned and utilized within the Teamsters to win good contracts, because again, we were having to deal with these ongoing strikes that we couldn't win because we didn't have public support. Nobody knew what those strikes were about. So I think hopefully we can take lessons learned from before within the union movement and move it forward.
Take those lessons learned in the past and move it forward, and build upon the movement and initiative that is beginning to take shape. Pooja, you know, don't tactics, boycotts, or something else kind of depend on the specific situation that you're in, the specific uh, response of people and their level of discontent and understanding. I in the past, I'm sure you've heard it in some sections of the left. There are calls for, we need a general strike, and we need it now, without any consideration of where the trade union movement is, its level of organization, strength, and what's specifically going on in each union, and so on and so forth. And I was kind of so there's a certain kind of false militancy and and counterposing one particular tactic against another one. And I was reminded of that when I saw a post by our comrades in DSA, um, calling into question the boycott tactic, saying, "Oh, they kind of poo-pooed it. They said that it's not organized, it wasn't coordinated, it focused on consumers and not workers, and that real action was to strike, you know? And by the way, we reached out to DSA's Instagram page and invited them to join us. So, DSA, if there's anybody out there who's listening, you're invited to come to discuss this issue with us. But wasn't that, what do you think about that? I don't want to, give you a leading question, but it seems to me that there was a certain tone deafness to where the people were, who consumers are, and what's appropriate at any given period. Am I wrong about that?
I think you're asking a union organizer about whether or not organizing is important, right? And I think that's really kind of what it boils down to. First of all, we should never be poo-pooing any sort of organic action that anybody is taking in defense of the working class against fascism. Any efforts should really be supported and really brought to light, right? Because it's difficult to do anything. I think I speak for a lot of people. I speak to a lot of working class people regularly in my job, and people are really frozen right now, and the anxiety is difficult to overcome. So any sort of movement that people are taking, regardless of what level of organization, I think should be commended, right? um, that said, I think a boycott is a tactic, a strike is a tactic. And anyone who's ever been involved in any sort of pressure campaign understands that the most effective tactics follow a series of escalation, right? So I think there's a lot of really interesting points here. This Target boycott, for example, I think is probably the most effective thing that happened in the boycott that was planned for last week. Um, and that was pretty organic, right? So to me that suggests, like, what is the demographic that made that popular, right? And I think Dom mentioned something in the comments about the mom vote, right? So I'm a mom now, and so I'm talking to a lot of moms, and it seems like people who are maybe not as energized or organized before this administration, they are really starting to understand the impact on, not having the Department of Education, not having all of these various things that make our lives better, right? So I think what we're seeing is, like, people are understanding there's going to be more of an impact on their direct lives. And I think people are becoming more open to wanting to become organized, right? And so I think poo-pooing on anything, any sort of organization that people do is not what we should be doing as people on the left in general, because we should be trying to build coalition with everybody, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, right? And their political ideology. And I think it signifies that there's so much potential work for us to do. It doesn't have to start at the strike, is what I always tell union members, because that's always the first question people ask me during organizing campaigns. Like, what if we go out on strike? Like, what's going to happen? And I always have to be like, well, first of all, you have to garner a lot of support for a strike. We would not go out on strike unless we can guarantee that people are on board, energized, and down to also strike, because striking is hard. Boycotting is hard. Doing anything that takes away from the ability to take care of your family is hard. And because of that, we need to figure out ways to support people who are willing to do this work, especially organically, right? So, like, how we should think about what was attractive to people about the Target boycott, right? What is attractive to people? Is it the fact that, like, for a lot of people, Target is sort of like an extra expenditure, right? Like, it's a place where you go to have a little fun. Like, you go to the $5 aisle, you buy some decorations, right? So maybe we can think about where are the other places that people have these sorts of expenditures, and where we can make a real impact, um, and how we can make that impact, and how we can organize more and more people to make more of an impact. Um, so to me, it's actually amazing, and, like, what has happened here is a beautiful sign of the energy that people are feeling. And honestly, um, in the face of such an onslaught of fascism, the fact that people are still rising up and saying things, um, uh, and still trying to fight against what's happening to them, is something to be energized by, is something to be celebrated and supported. So it's on us, I think, as the left, to figure out where are these pockets of support coming from, where is this class struggle starting to amplify, and how can we really support that and make it bigger.
During the 1960s, it was a similar situation where the civil rights movement, they were engaging in this tactic and that tactic. And then there was a spontaneous initiative on the part of, African Americans and whites and others in the South to take the struggle to a higher level. And they moved on their own. And Martin said, "There go my people. I got to go catch up with them." And so when you see this mass initiative on the part of rank and file people that just comes out of nowhere, they're teaching us something. They're showing by their action that, we haven't responded adequately to what's taken place and the need to uh, apply mass demonstrable pressure that hits the ruling class in the pocketbook. Because that's the only thing we say over and over again, that the only thing that the ruling class in this country understands is power. And when you stop production, when you hit them in the pocketbook, when 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 you block the flow of goods, you know, when you make it impossible for business as usual to take place, that's when change occurs. And so when there's this initiative, we support it, we join with it. We when it's over, we draw the lessons, and then we, as you said, Pooja, we escalate as it is appropriate as we go down the road of struggle. And there are additional boycotts planned over the next period, and we should support them. May Day is coming up, and there's going to be big worker demonstrations in defense of immigrant rights all over the country. We should join with that, and local demonstrations around a whole number of different issues, whether it be the abolition of the Department of Education, or whether it be on the issue of Medicaid. And now they promised not to touch Social Security. And guess what they're going to do? Yeah, they're going to put their hands on Social Security. And watch out when that happens. Well, we have one more question before we end. We have a mailbag. People write in and ask us questions. And today they ask, what is your opinion on Trump's approach to Gaza? I'm worried about what he will do in the region, and I'm wondering, what is the CPUSA stance on the issue? 1 minute from our panelists. Who would like to go first? What do you think about Trump's response on Gaza? Anybody? Any takers?
I guess that's I guess that's what you'd expect from a real estate magnate that doesn't see people but only sees money. I think it's such a dangerous approach to continue the killing, to continue the actual threat to people in the region, not only the Palestinians, but also the Israeli people who can never live in a situation of peace with that going on.
Good point. Good point. Anybody else? I'll tell you what I think. I think it's an abomination. I think it's ethnic cleansing. I think that it has the potential to be Nazi-like. It strengthens the right wing in Israel, who have no intention of allowing a two-state solution. They want to displace the Palestinians, or send them to Egypt, send them to Jordan. And by the way, the people of those countries, Lebanon, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, will never accept it. And the Palestinian people themselves will never accept it. And it don't get me started. We have to support BDS. Somebody just put it on the boycott.
Yeah, Joe. Yeah,
Yes.
Joe. Yeah, just
Go
jumping
on,
in. I
Joe.
mean, yeah, just jumping in. I mean, this is another reason for us to take on this battle to fight Trump in what he is doing in Gaza, and it goes back to economics. We must go after the groups that support Trump. The economic boycotts are important. Elon Musk, Tesla, in other things, other corporations, Target, so forth and so on. Economic boycotts are good. I mean, this is who would have thought this is a better time to buy local? you know, forming coalitions with local groups that move our economic, our purchasing power away from corporations to local businesses, small businesses. We need to get into the grassroots. There's ways of doing it. May is going to be an excellent time to really launch some major boycotts going after corporations that support Trump. I mean, we should be targeted. We should figure out what the narrative is, build those coalitions, and be prepared for a month of boycotts, roving boycotts, really making it clear that we are against corporations, the billionaires who are supporting Trump, who are allowing these type of narratives, these attack on Gaza and the people there. So that's my 2 cents.
And Joe, can I just add, please, that this is even goes beyond economics. I can't help so ironically but think of the Nazi policy of Judenrein, to just rid the country of all Jews. And now this is Trump's policy about Palestine, just get rid of all Palestinians. This goes beyond economics. It's hate, it's fascism, it's racism. And this kind of a policy is so dangerous to the whole world and to everybody that that it could even be spoken. And for our country to, we have to be so clear that it is completely unacceptable. I don't even have the words for when you talk about removing an entire people and turning their beautiful country into a playground for the rich. I think that goes beyond economics, and it represents the underlying hate and inhumanity of fascism.
It's
Let me
genocide.
let me
That's
let
what it
me let
is.
me hop in here really quickly, just to not to beat a dead horse, right? But I think it's also important to understand that, like, obviously the Biden administration was the genesis of a lot of this that's happening currently, right? So I think it's important because we have to be very clear-eyed about the fact that, like, people who are most affected by this, Muslim Americans, Palestinian Americans, like, they are still not looking, they don't have a relationship of trust with a lot of people who have aligned themselves perhaps with the Democratic Party on the issue of Israel Palestine, right? I think that's different for our party, obviously, and who we are as working class people. But I think it's also like it's not just Trump, right? It's basically the policy of the United States as a country, as an institution. The thing that's happening with Trump is obviously the extreme version of it, but it's not dissimilar in ideology from what was happening under the last administration. So we have to be really clear-eyed about the fact that we actually, not only do we have to support and talk about the reality of what Trump is doing, but we have to talk about, like, why did we even get into that position? We have to talk about the Nakba. We have to talk about the history of why this issue is happening, and we have to provide a safe and effective alternative for the people most impacted by it to join with us as working class people. So I think it's important to talk about Trump's approach in Gaza. I think it's also important to talk about how the US as a whole has not only failed at defending Palestine, but it, like, is the reason why a lot of this stuff is happening right now. So just not to derail us, and I don't want to get trapped in the idea of, like, we need to talk about Biden, we need to talk about all this stuff, but we do have to be honest about the fact that the alternative, the reason why Donald Trump is sitting in the office that he is right now, is because of the fact that the Democratic Party was not able to deliver a clear enough vision on rebuilding and protecting Palestinians in this current struggle. So we have to think about how can we actually provide real work on that front.
Well said. And what happened was that Kamala Harris refused to. She couldn't find a way to distance herself from that policy. And the polls later showed that a big section of the electorate that didn't vote for her for precisely that reason. And it's true that the ruling class policy on the issue of Palestine, and as it is on China, was a united policy. And as a result, the response has to be a growing united response in the peace and solidarity movement, and BDS provides a way to do that by boycotting sports, by boycotting cultural events, film, by divest the movement on the colleges to divest their portfolios, their endowments, union pension funds, divest, bring as much economic, political, moral pressure as possible to force, because again, the only thing that these people understand is power. There she goes. Relationships. Hey, baby girl, relationships are power. Well, we have had a wonderful discussion this morning. Thank you, Pooja. Thank you. Thank you. There she's shaking her hands. Thank you, Bobby. Joe, thank you. Thank you very much. Lots of important lessons. And we will be back next week for another edition of Good Morning Revolution. Until then, stay strong, stay safe, and whatever you do, stay in the fight. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye bye.